Hey, what's up everyone? My name is Nicholas Corcel and you're watching The Literary Nomad. Today we're going back to Mao II by Don DeLillo and we're going to be taking a deep dive into chapter 3. In this chapter we really get a comprehensive overview and some substantial development of a lot of the themes that DeLillo is working on throughout the whole novel. This is the first time where we really get to confront and explore like the true essence of what it's about. And DeLillo masterfully does this by really simplifying the plot in this chapter. So basically the entire chapter takes place in one room where Brita is taking photos of Bill. And remember, the whole reason that Brita is allowed into the cabin is to take some photos for Bill, or to take some photos of Bill rather. And Bill hasn't been seen for many years. He's that Salinger pension type of character, but he allowed Brita to come and take his photo. And so as she's taking photos of him, they start to talk, and they start to talk about art and the nature of the artist. And we get a lot of very interesting anecdotes and comparisons. Particularly, we get a lot of comparisons between the role of the artist and the role of the terrorist, which in essence is the entire point of this novel. This begins as soon as she walks into his workshop room, and she describes the feeling as it being an uneasy force, the strangeness of seeing a man who had lived in her mind for years as words alone. The force of a body in a room. And then later describing the room, she says, these were charts, master plans evidently, the maps of his works in progress. Think about what it would feel like to interact with and be in the same room as an artist that you've admired for many years. Almost have a relationship with writers and artists that we enjoy their work. If you watch a lot of a director's films or if you read a lot of novels, you're getting, like, this book is a very intimate piece of Don DeLillo. I've never met him, I never will. I've never had a conversation with him, but in many ways, I've had a more intimate experience with him than perhaps even people of his own family, because when I am working on fiction of my own, a lot of the ideas that I'm slipping in there are ideas that I wouldn't even talk about with my own family, and things that are pretty uncomfortable, to say to people that you know and love, but for some reason, when you slip it into fiction and you're talking to strangers, it gets a lot easier. And so we see Brita, she's feeling this uneasiness. She's feeling this fear almost of being in this room with Bill. She sees the works in progress. So she, like, the curtains get pulled back and she's seeing the maps and the charts and all the crazy things that we do when we're working on a novel. She sees all that firsthand, and it really throws her off her game at first, but then she quickly grounds herself by having just a normal conversation with him. After telling Bill that she needs to know the person for her work to shine, they begin to talk about the image world. And Bill says that the image world is corrupt. Here is a man who hides his face. Bill then foils this by bringing up Islam and their relation to the image world. And he says, in a mosque, no images. In our world, we sleep and eat the image and pray to it and wear it too. The writer who won't show his face is encroaching on holy turf. He's playing God's own trick. And then Brita says, maybe he's just shy, Bill. And so we get this playfulness, Bill says something very, very serious, and he makes a point about the modern world, talking about how the West is obsessed with what we call the image world, this world that is seen through the lens of TikTok. And of course, this book was written way before TikTok. This book was written even before 9/11. But we see that has continued to grow even today. We live in a world where, the attention span is decreasing with each passing year. You go to a school and no kid is reading, they're all scrolling through TikTok. All of your information is given to you in bite-sized little anecdotes. Even like sporting events, they're seen through the lens of social media more so than they are seen through the lens of just watching the whole complete thing. And so this is really interesting. And then Bill talks about how in the Islamic world, specifically in a mosque, this isn't the case. So we're positioning the West and the rest of the world as two separate entities almost, and we're talking about how the West is an image world and the Islamic world is not. And I think that provides a very interesting foundation for the rest of the book to build on. And then we even build on it in this section. So we have the West here, which is the image world, and the purveyor of their messaging is the writer, the artist. And then we have over here, we have the Islamic world, and Bill is saying that the purveyor of their messaging is the terrorist. And the terrorist is the only one who is able to transcend from this world over into the West. And so through these extreme acts of terrorism, that's the only way that this world can kind of disrupt the image world. Because we live in a world that is not discourse-based, but it's rather headline-based. And so when you're scrolling through your feed, you're not going to see well-reasoned points from this world. No, you're going to see something like 9/11 that would break through. And it's hard to break through that plane because in between these two worlds, there's a plane, right down the middle. And it's very hard for either side to communicate through that plane, through that wall. And so we're saying the two people that are capable of doing that is the writer or the artist and then the terrorist. And this whole novel is talking about which one of those two is more effective. Interestingly enough, a few pages later, Brita even brings up the World Trade Center directly. And there's a couple mentions of the Twin Towers and things in this book. And this book was published a long time before that attack happened. And I'd be interested to hear from any of you guys that were alive during the attack. Because I was alive, but I was only 1 year old. And it's interesting because were the Twin Towers such a major thing that somebody in New York would talk about frequently? Or were they more insignificant? Because my understanding were that the Twin Towers were always kind of like second fiddle to the Empire State Building, but I could be very wrong about that. Regardless, we get some humanization of it. Brita says, I already have the World Trade Center, Bill says, and it's already harmless and ageless, forgotten looking. And think how much worse. What? If there was only one tower instead of two? You mean they interact? There's a play of light? Wouldn't a single tower be much worse? No, because my big complaint is only partly size. The size is deadly, but having two of them is like a comment. It's like a dialogue. Only I don't know what they're saying. They're saying, have a nice day. These towers have been humanized. They're talking to each other. And these towers are almost signifiers of the West. And the fact that, we talk about the whole point of this novel is these two worlds in communication, like I just talked about. And it's hard for either side to break through the plane. Well, that's an example of how that plane was broken. And I think that DeLillo, or at least DeLillo's perspective, as stated in this book, would say that is an example of the terrorist being an artist in the sense of the communicator of the big ideas of the world. So I think that that's super interesting. And then later on in that same page, and then it spills over onto page 41, Brita talks about how terrorism and terror is a central part of her life, her daily life. And she says, it's crazy. I'm devoting my life to a gesture. Yes, I travel, which means there's no moment on certain days when I'm not thinking terror. They have us in their power. In boarding areas, I never sit near windows in case of flying glass. I carry a Swedish passport, so that's okay. Unless you believe that terrorists killed their prime minister. So she's even talking about, being fearful of having an American passport and using a EU passport that is a more neutral country, I guess, for lack of a better word. And so that's very interesting. And then we get another example of this later again on page 41. But in between that, we get one of the best anecdotes about the craft of creating art that I've ever encountered. So before we go back to the next example of terror and artists being linked, I really want to touch on that. In some exposition about Brita, talking about her workflow, it says, she liked working past the feeling of this is it. Important to keep going, obliterate the sure thing, and come upon a moment of stealthy blessing. And that, I think, is an excellent description of what it means to create art. We are trying to do something that transcends. I think that's kind of the goal of every artistic endeavor. So I've written something and, there is a stage where you get to where you're like, okay, yeah, this is it. This is what I want to say. But that is not transcendent. And so you have to push past that and you have to obliterate the guaranteed 7 out of 10. Because I think most good writers can consistently write at least 7 out of 10 quality, And by that I mean there's no errors. The grammar makes sense. Everything makes sense. Everything is right. To try to get that 10 out of 10 or a 9 out of 10 even, you have to kill the 7 and risk a 5. So when you try to do something great, you're rolling the dice. You're obliterating the sure thing and hoping to come upon how DeLillo describes a moment of stealthy blessing. And I think that's incredible. And I think it's very, very accurate. Moving on now to what I just mentioned earlier about the second example of the novelist and the terrorist being linked on that same page 41. They say, there's a curious knot that binds novelists and terrorists. In the West, we become famous effigies as our books lose the power to shape and influence. Do you ask your writers how they feel about this? Years ago, I used to think it was possible for a novelist to alter the inner life of the culture. Now bomb makers and gunmen have taken that territory. They make raids on human consciousness. What writers used to do before we were all incorporated. And then Brita encourages this, saying, keep going, I like your anger. And that's interesting. You know, we're talking about the quote-unquote raid of our consciousness. And that is the goal of the artist, and by extension, that is the goal of the terrorist. You know, a terrorist attack means nothing if it's not reported on, which is very interesting. Like, terrorist attacks would probably end right now if every single media group in the world and every single citizen in the world said, we won't report on it, we won't mention it. 9/11 happens, nobody says nothing. So say somebody in Chicago has no idea that it ever happened. What then is the incentive to do another attack? There is none. Because the idea is this attack draws tons of information, it positions them above us, and it makes their dialogue be more widely known, and then people can either like it or dislike it. Obviously, most people dislike it, but I think it'd be foolish to say that there are no people that are attracted to it, because of course there are. The novelist plays a similar role in society. You know, they publish and people discuss, but if nobody reads, then what is the point of publication? So I don't know, I think that's super interesting, because we're seeing the novel, the quote-unquote the novel, die in real time. So what is the point of publishing in a modern context? And because the point is decreasing with every passing year, and some definitions of the point, which I'm going off of this book in particular, as the point is decreasing, will we see less? And eventually, will we see none? Will we see the novelist die? I don't think that we will, but I think that I don't know if we'll see another rich crop of novelists as we have in the past. You know, you go like into the Lost Generation, you can list like 50 that were just outstanding, and then there's probably 50 more that I don't even know of that are equally as good. I don't know if when we characterize the 2000s, I don't know if we will have that same quality, or at least that depth. I think at the top, there'll always be 5 to 10 transcendent novelists at any time living, but I think that the depth could decrease, and I wouldn't be surprised if it did. And quickly, before we wrap up the video, there's one more important plot point that we need to hit, and that is Brita brings up this man named Charles Everson towards the end of the novel, and that's going to be the catalyst that really drives the plot forward for the rest of the book. And so she just says, incidentally, I bring a message from Charles Everson. She says she met him at a publishing dinner, and he asked about Bill, and they got to talking, and Charlie wants to talk to Bill. And that is going to become very, very big. It kind of quickly dies down in this chapter. It's not developed too much. Bill says the more books I publish, the weaker we become, with we being, of course, the writer. The secret force that drives the industry is the compulsion to make writers harmless. Brita says, you like being a little bit fanatical. I know the feeling, believe me. But what is more harmless than the pure game of making up? You want to do baseball in your room. Maybe it's just a metaphor, an innocence. But isn't that what makes your books popular? You call it a lost game that you've been trying to recover as a writer. Maybe it's not so lost. What you say you're writing toward. Isn't this what people see in your work? I only know what I see, Bill says, or rather what I don't see. And so the baseball reference, I didn't talk about it in depth or at all, I don't think. He just talks about how he's trying to recreate that childhood innocence as a kid, just thinking up and dreaming of baseball. And that's what he's writing towards with his novels, trying to really dig under the skin of what humanity is, you know, kind of touching on that very popular idea that the closest we get to humanity is birth, and as we age and grow, we kind of grow away from our innate humanity, which I think in many ways that's true. I think when you look at a child, they're all good at the most core level. In adults, of course, it's not the case. You know, you look at the worst humans alive, say like an Adolf Hitler or whatever. As a baby, he was just a core human expression of humanity, right? He wanted, I'm sure he wanted just, you know, water, his mother, his father, food, toys, basic things like that. And as you grow, you either grow towards the good or you grow towards the bad. But I think that if you, like that sweet spot, that innocence, as we like to call it in English, is the truest expression of humanity. And I think that's really what DeLillo was touching on there. Regardless, there was a lot going on in chapter 3, and I think it was masterful for DeLillo to be able to convey all that in a conversation. He really just kind of stripped it all down and just said, okay, we're going to have one room, very little distractions plot-wise, and we're just going to talk about these ideas. And in that dialogue is where DeLillo shines the most. And I really, really enjoyed chapter 3. It's my favorite chapter so far, and I'm very excited to continue into chapter 4 with you guys next time. If you guys enjoyed this video, don't forget to like, comment, and subscribe, and I'll see you in the next one.